Da-na-na-na-na. Da-da-da-da-da. Am I pretty enough? Welcome, Second Cup with Steve. I'm gonna do something a little different today. Got a different pair of glasses on. I love coffee. I'm gonna read you a story. I found this story, it's gotta be probably 20, maybe 22 years ago that I found this. I've used it on occasion, but I've not done it very much. But it's one of those things, when I read it the first time, I was moved, and I just really had to stop and, let my emotions catch up with what I'd read and what it was doing in my brain. So I'm going to read it to you, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about it. So it's called the story, The Four Brave Chaplains. Many stories have been written about the heroic acts of four Army chaplains aboard a troop transport ship on its way to Greenland. One such story follows. It was written by Victor M.Parachin, an ordained minister, counselor, and freelance writer. It was the evening of February 2nd, 1943, and the U.S. Army transport Dorchester was crowded to capacity, carrying 902 servicemen, merchant seamen, and civilian workers. Once a luxury coastal liner, the vessel had been converted into an Army transport ship. The Dorchester, one of three ships in the SG-19 convoy, was moving steadily across the icy waters from Newfoundland towards the American base in Greenland. SG-19 was escorted by Coast Guard cutters Tampa, Escanaba, and the Comanche. Hans Danielson, the ship's captain, was concerned and cautious. Earlier, the Tampa had detected a submarine with its sonar. Danielson knew that in the dangerous waters, even before he got the alarming information, that he needed to be careful. German U-boats were constantly prowling these vital sea lanes. Several ships had already been blasted and sunk. The Dorchester was now only 150 miles from its destination, but the captain ordered the men to sleep in their clothing and keep their life jackets on. Many soldiers sleeping deep in the ship's hold disregarded the order because of the engine's heat. Others ignored it because the life jackets were uncomfortable. On February 3rd at 12:55 a.m., a periscope broke the chilly Atlantic waters. Through the crosshairs, an officer aboard the German submarine U-223 spotted the Dorchester. After identifying and targeting the ship, he gave the order to fire the torpedoes. The hit was decisive and deadly, striking the starboard side amidship far below the waterline. Danielson, alerted the Dorchester was taking water rapidly and sinking, gave the order to abandon ship. In less than 27 minutes, the Dorchester would slip beneath the Atlantic's icy waters. Tragically, the hit had knocked out power and radio contact with the three escort ships. The Comanche, however, saw the flash of the explosion. It responded and then rescued 97 survivors. The Escanaba circled the Dorchester, rescuing an additional 132 survivors, and the third cutter, Tampa, continued on, escorting the remaining two ships. Aboard the Dorchester, panic and chaos had set in. The blast had killed scores of men, and many more were seriously wounded. Others, stunned by the explosion, were groping in the darkness. Those sleeping without clothing rushed topside, where they were confronted first by a blast of icy Arctic air and then the knowledge that death awaited. Men jumped from the ship into lifeboats, overcrowding them to the point of capsizing, according to eyewitnesses. Other rafts tossed in the Atlantic drifted away before soldiers could get in them. Through the pandemonium, according to those present, four Army chaplains brought hope in despair and light in darkness. Those chaplains were Lieutenant George Fox, Methodist, Lieutenant Alexander Good, Jewish, Lieutenant John Washington, Roman Catholic, and Lieutenant Clark Poling, Dutch Reformed. Quickly and quietly, the four chaplains spread out among the soldiers. There they tried to calm the frightened, tend the wounded, and guide the disoriented toward safety. Witnesses of that terrible night remember hearing the four offer prayers for the dying and encouragement for those who would live. One witness, Private William Bednar, found himself floating in oil-smeared water, surrounded by dead bodies and debris. I could hear men crying, pleading, and praying, he recalls. I could also hear the chaplains preaching courage. Their voices were the only thing that kept me going. Another sailor, Petty Officer John Mahoney, tried to re-enter his cabin, but was stopped by Rabbi Good. Mahoney, concerned about the cold Arctic air, explained he'd forgotten his gloves. "Never mind," Good responded. "I have 2 pair." The rabbi then gave the petty officer his own gloves. In retrospect, Mahoney realized that Rabbi Good was not conveniently carrying 2 pair of gloves, and that the rabbi had decided not to leave the Dorchester. By this time, most of the men were topside, and the chaplains opened a storage locker and began distributing life jackets. It was then that engineer Grady Clark witnessed an astonishing sight. When there were no more life jackets in the storage room, the chaplains removed theirs and gave them to 4 frightened young men. "It was the finest thing I have ever seen or hoped to see the sight of heaven," said John Ladd, another survivor who saw the chaplain's selfless act. Ladd's response is understandable. The altruistic action of the Four Chaplains constitutes one of the purest spiritual and ethical acts a person can make. When given their life jackets, Rabbi Good did not call out for a Jew. Father Washington did not call out for a Catholic, nor did the Reverends Fox or Poling call out for a Protestant. They simply gave their jackets to the next man in line. As the ship went down, survivors in nearby rafts could see the 4 chaplains arm-length and braced against the slanting deck. They could hear their voices offering prayers. Of the 902 men aboard the Dorchester, 672 died, leaving 230 survivors. When the news reached the American shores, the nation was stunned by the magnitude of the tragedy and the heroic conduct of the 4 chaplains. "Valor is a gift," Carl Sandburg once said. "Those having it never know for sure they have it until the test comes." That night, Reverend Fox, Rabbi Good, Reverend Poling, and Father Washington passed life's ultimate test. In doing so, they became an enduring example of extraordinary faith, courage, and selflessness. The Distinguished Service Cross and Purple Heart was awarded posthumously to all 4 of them, December 19th, 1944. That line, they just gave it to the next man in line. It moves me emotionally as much today as it did the first time I read it. It takes me to the story of the Good Samaritan and what that man did. Not caring that the man that had been beaten and robbed and destroyed was of a different race, of a different ilk, of a different people than he. He simply saw a man in need and stretched out his hand to help. These 4 chaplains, it's exactly what they did. They saw a man in need, didn't hesitate, took their jacket off, gave it to the next man in line. When Jesus finishes the parable of the Good Samaritan, the teacher of the law that was trying to trap him, trying to trick him, said, "What's the greatest commandment?" Jesus said, "These 2, love God and love your neighbor." The man challenged Jesus and said, "Who's my neighbor?" Jesus answered that challenge by telling us the story of the Good Samaritan. And when he finishes the story of the Good Samaritan, he simply looked at him and said, "Go and do likewise. Go and do the very same thing. Hand life to the next person in line. Don't qualify them. Don't try to figure out whether they deserve it, because none of us deserve it. None of us are owed. None of us have any rights to any of it. But God so loved the world that he gave his son Jesus to pay the price so that you and I could put that life jacket on and leave the disaster that's behind us and move forward into a future." They don't know who those 4 young men were, but they went on to live lives. They went on to be men of purpose and direction, because the 4 chaplains handed their life jackets to the next man in line. So I don't know how this affects you and what the Lord speaks to you on this, but I want to challenge you today. Don't let the love of Jesus that's in you remain dormant, but let it be on fire, and let it be effective in reaching lost people, because without Jesus there is no hope, but with Jesus we have an eternal hope. Father, I thank you today. Lord, this story stirs my heart, and I can't imagine not being able to help somebody in need. Lord, whatever you put in front of us, whatever you ask us to do, whatever lies before us, would you give us the courage of these 4 men, Lord, to make that kind of altruistic decision to say, I'll give rather than receive, I'll work rather than rest, I'll do rather than not. Help us to have that mental state. Help us to have the fullness of spirit within each one of us, that we would simply give the life jacket to the next man in line. Thank you, Jesus. Help us, I pray. In your name. Amen. Amen. God bless you, day.